Jonathan Hale was a man who had everything: wealth, power, control. From the glass tower of his company in Chicago, he commanded an empire worth billions. Every deal was precise, every decision calculated. To the outside world, he was untouchable. But what happens when the man who has mastered every detail of life discovers the one thing he cannot control: his own heart? When a storm grounds his flight home from Europe, Jonathan finds himself in an ordinary hotel room with his assistant, Claire Whitman. For 3 years, she has been the quiet presence at his side, anticipating every need, protecting every secret. To him, she was efficiency personified. Until that night, a night of conversation, of truths long buried, of two souls stripped bare by thunder and silence. Could a canceled flight change the course of a man's life? Could love unexpected, inconvenient, undeniable be worth risking everything he has built? This is not just a story of power and romance. It is a story about choices, about breaking free from cages we build ourselves, and about daring to reach for something more. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss stories that might just change the way you see your own life. Jonathan Hale's office sat like a crown atop the tallest skyscraper in downtown Chicago, 44 stories above the streets. It overlooked Lake Michigan, where the late afternoon sun scattered 1,000 shards of silver light across the water. From here, the city looked orderly, almost obedient. Cars traced straight lines down Michigan Avenue. People shrank to the size of chess pieces. It was a view that reinforced Jonathan's belief that life was meant to be controlled, organized, and managed like the perfect blueprint. Inside the office, nothing was accidental. The mahogany desk gleamed as if it had been polished that morning. 3 computer monitors glowed with cascading data: stock prices, aerospace projections, quarterly forecasts. Not a single file lay out of place. The air smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. Jonathan moved with precision, his tall frame and broad shoulders giving him an air of command. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and though only 42, he carried himself like a man who had long ago traded spontaneity for certainty. He adjusted his tie, glanced once more at the spreadsheets before him, and spoke without looking up. "Claire, the procurement schedule is lagging. I need the suppliers to tighten their delivery windows. By Friday, not Monday." Across the desk, Claire Whitman lifted her pen and nodded, her auburn hair pulled neatly into a bun. She wore a navy blazer, crisp and professional, and her posture never faltered. She was 29, sharp-eyed, efficient, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "I'll call the vendors directly," she replied, her voice calm and measured, "and I'll confirm with you once I have their revised commitments." Jonathan finally looked up, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. They were green, steady, impossible to read. For 3 years she had been at his side, scheduling his meetings, managing his flights, ensuring every detail of Hale dynamics ran without disruption. In all that time, she had never raised her voice, never stumbled, never shown even a crack in the armor of professionalism. She was, in Jonathan's mind, the perfect assistant, precise, unflappable, a machine in human form. He returned to his screen, his voice clipped. "And make sure the European contracts are ready before next week's summit. The Geneva presentation is not the place for errors." "Already handled," she said, without hesitation. "The slides are finalized and in your briefcase." Of course they were. They always were. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, gazing briefly out at the skyline. Everything in his world was like this: anticipated, structured, perfected. He had built Hale Dynamics from a 2-person startup in his garage to one of the most respected aerospace technology firms in the United States. He commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and silenced competitors with the sheer force of his logic. What he did not do, what he had never allowed himself to do, was lose control. Claire's voice interrupted his thoughts. "There's one more thing. Yes, the Weather Service is forecasting severe storms across the East Coast this weekend. I've already reserved backup flights for both of us. in case Sunday's return from Geneva is disrupted. Jonathan's eyes flickered with something unusual, perhaps surprise, perhaps admiration, but it was gone almost immediately. He gave a curt nod. Efficient as always. "It's my job, Mr. Hale." The words were simple, yet they lingered in the room longer than they should have. For a fraction of a second, Jonathan felt the faintest ripple in his carefully still waters, but he brushed it aside and turned back to the monitors. A buzz from the intercom. "Mr. Hale, your 4:30 is waiting. Send them in." Claire rose smoothly, closing her portfolio. At the door, she paused. "Safe travels next week." The words seemed ordinary, yet something about the way she said them, a softness, a human warmth rarely present in this office, made Jonathan glance up. But she was already gone, leaving only the faint echo of her heels and the trace of vanilla in the air. Jonathan turned back to his screens. For the first time in years, his focus slipped, numbers blurred. His gaze drifted toward the window, where clouds gathered on the horizon, gray and unsettled. Weather, he reminded himself, was one of the few variables no man could control. But he had always found a way to work around nature's disruptions. He would find a way this time, too. Yet, in a quiet corner of his mind, a place he rarely acknowledged, he felt something shift, as though the storm outside had already found its way in. Jonathan Hale's life ran like clockwork. To the board members, investors, and employees who looked up to him, he was the very definition of control. The city of Chicago might twist and roar beneath his tower, but inside his world, order reigned. Meetings started at the precise minute. Emails never went unanswered. Contracts were checked and rechecked before his signature touched the page. Yet, there were cracks, hairline fractures only visible to someone watching closely. Late at night, long after his staff had gone home, Jonathan often remained in his office. From the street below, his light was the lone beacon at the top of the glass tower. He told himself it was efficiency, a commitment to staying ahead. But sometimes, when the spreadsheets blurred and the silence pressed too heavily, he would drift toward the window. There, with the city stretching endlessly in every direction, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, wondering, what would his life have been like if he had chosen differently? The memory always returned in fragments, like old film reels replaying without sound. A boy no older than 12, crouched over balsa wood and glue in the corner of a cold boarding school dormitory. A model airplane taking shape under small, eager hands. A rare spark of joy. Then his father's voice stern, dismissive, reminding him that dreams were distractions, that grades mattered more than imagination. Jonathan's parents had been diplomats, faces always turned outward to the world. At home, there had been no warmth, no laughter echoing through the hallways, only polished surfaces, perfect posture, and expectations sharper than glass. He learned early that emotion was dangerous. To want something for himself was weakness. To show disappointment or hurt was shameful. So he buried those impulses, stone by stone, until the boy who once dreamed of flight became the man who calculated every move in advance. He told himself it was strength. But in the quiet of his office, staring at the glow of streetlights below, it often felt like emptiness. Claire Whitman noticed things others did not. She never intruded, never asked questions that might pierce his carefully maintained armor. Instead, she anticipated his needs before he voiced them. If he had a meeting that promised conflict, there would be black coffee waiting, extra strong. If his schedule demanded back-to-back negotiations, she arranged quiet 5-minute breaks where he could stand by the window and collect himself. Once, during a particularly grueling merger, he had mentioned in passing that his throat was raw from days of speaking. The next morning, without fanfare, there was a small box of herbal lozenges on his desk. She never acknowledged it, and neither did he. But he remembered. It was her way seeing the small fractures and covering them before anyone else noticed. Jonathan never thanked her. He rarely even looked at her for long. In his mind, gratitude was indulgence, dependence was weakness. Yet, somewhere deep within, He felt the quiet safety of her presence, the way she kept his world from collapsing under its own weight, and Claire, for her part, understood more than she ever let on. Over 3 years, she had studied him like an intricate puzzle, the way he tapped his pen exactly 5 times before a meeting he dreaded, the way his jaw tightened whenever family was mentioned in conversation, the way he lingered, just for a second, at the window at 3:47 each afternoon, as though pulled back to some half-forgotten memory. He never saw her watching. That was the irony. She had built her career around being invisible in the right ways, present, efficient, indispensable, yet never demanding attention. She had learned to smooth over rough edges, to solve problems before they reached his desk, to be the silent backbone of Hale dynamics. But she was not a machine. She was a woman with her own dreams, her own scars, and though she had never spoken them aloud, she sometimes wondered what it would be like if Jonathan Hale turned away from his glowing monitors and actually saw her not as a perfect assistant, but as a human being. One evening, as they prepared final logistics for the Geneva summit, Claire placed a folder on Jonathan's desk. He was hunched over a screen, his tie loosened slightly, fatigue etched into the lines around his eyes. For a fleeting second, she considered saying something, asking if he was all right, if he ever felt tired of the endless grind, but she didn't. She knew the answer, or at least the one he would give. "Here are the briefing papers for Geneva," she said instead. Jonathan looked up briefly, his gaze sharp, clinical. "Thank you. Leave them here." She placed the folder carefully, her fingers brushing the polished wood. Then she turned, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Jonathan watched her leave. He told himself it was because he needed to ensure she had filed the papers in the correct order. But as the door closed, he found his eyes lingering on the faint echo of her presence. For just a heartbeat, the office felt emptier than usual. Jonathan Hale had everything a billion-dollar company, a corner office in the sky, the respect of peers and rivals alike. But the truth, hidden behind glass and steel, was simple. He had built a fortress so strong that no one could break through. And sometimes, in the quiet hours when the city lights flickered far below, he wasn't sure if he was protecting himself from the world or from the possibility of being seen. The Geneva summit was the kind of event Jonathan Hale lived for, rooms filled with sharp suits and sharper minds, where contracts were worth more than small nations' annual budgets. It was the arena where Hale Dynamics proved its dominance, where Jonathan's reputation as an unshakable strategist was both tested and reinforced. The days leading up to the trip were a blur of preparation. Jonathan reviewed presentations until midnight, fine-tuning every slide, every bullet point, until no question could rattle him. His team marveled at his stamina, but Claire Whitman knew better. She saw the way his shoulders stiffened after the 10th revision, the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when he thought no one was looking. Still, she never mentioned it. Instead, she adapted. While Jonathan dictated last-minute changes, Claire adjusted the logistics in real time, hotel confirmations, car rentals, diplomatic receptions, even the exact brand of bottled water he preferred during long panels. When he asked for the forecast of market growth in Eastern Europe, the figures were already printed, tabbed, and color-coded. It was like a dance they had perfected. Jonathan led with relentless precision, and Claire followed with quiet grace, smoothing every step before it became a stumble. On the morning of departure, the private car waited outside his high-rise. Jonathan entered with his usual efficiency, briefcase in hand, tie flawless, expression unreadable. Claire was already seated, tablet open, reviewing flight details. "Chicago to Zurich," she said softly. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Arrival 7:10 a.m. local time. Driver in Geneva will meet us at baggage claim with the itinerary." Jonathan gave a short nod. "And the contracts. In your case, second pocket from the left." His hand brushed the leather interior of the briefcase, finding the folder without looking. He didn't thank her. He never did. But Claire noticed the faint relaxation in his posture, the way he trusted her without hesitation. The flight was long, filled with silence, broken only by the tapping of Jonathan's laptop keys and the occasional clink of glasses from the cabin crew. Claire kept to her notes, occasionally glancing at him when he wasn't looking. His concentration was like a fortress solid, impenetrable. She wondered, not for the first time, what it might be like to see him when the walls came down. In Geneva, the air was crisp, the lake shimmering against the backdrop of the Alps. The International Conference Center buzzed with energy. Diplomats, executives, and journalists filled the marble halls, each conversation carrying the weight of millions of dollars. Jonathan moved through it all like a general on a battlefield. His voice was steady, his arguments razor-sharp. Contracts were negotiated down to the comma. Rivals hesitated under his unblinking gaze. Every handshake was measured, every promise calculated, and always, 3 steps behind, Claire. She carried the portfolio, adjusted the schedules, handed him documents at the exact second he needed them. Her quiet presence made the machinery run, unnoticed by most, essential to Jonathan. During one late evening debrief in their hotel suite, Jonathan stood before the window overlooking Lake Geneva, dictating revisions for the Yamamoto contract. Claire sat on the sofa, transcribing, her legs tucked neatly under her hair finally loosening after 12 straight hours of work. "The indemnity clause is too narrow," Jonathan said, his reflection cold against the glass. "We need broader coverage for intellectual property." "Already highlighted," Claire murmured, her voice calm. "I'll adjust the draft tonight." For a moment, Jonathan almost turned, almost told her she didn't need to stay up another hour, that she should rest, but the words stalled on his tongue. Instead, he nodded once. "Good." She looked down, hiding the faintest smile. On the third day, as the conference wound to a close, success was evident. The Swiss partnership had been secured. The Japanese consortium confirmed their backing, and negotiations with Sweden were advancing. It was, by every measure, flawless. And then, as they stepped out of the grand hall into the crisp evening air, Claire glanced at her phone. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "the National Weather Service has upgraded its forecast. Severe storms sweeping across the Northeast this weekend. Flights into New York may be grounded." Jonathan barely slowed his stride. "We don't make decisions based on weather predictions. Stick to the schedule." Claire hesitated, her green eyes flicking across his profile. He didn't notice the way her hand tightened around the phone. "Yes, Mr. Hale." As their driver opened the car door, Jonathan cast one last look at the sky. Clouds were gathering over the Alps, heavy and uncertain. But in his world, storms were obstacles to be managed, not omens to be feared. What he didn't realize was that this storm would not only disrupt his schedule, it would dismantle the carefully constructed life he had built one flight, one delay, one night at a time. The Geneva airport gleamed under fluorescent lights, a palace of glass and steel filled with weary travelers. The summit had ended in triumph, contracts signed, handshakes exchanged, and Jonathan Hale had already shifted his mind to the next quarter's projections. His life ran on schedules, and tonight, his schedule demanded a smooth flight back to New York. But schedules meant little to the storm barreling across the Atlantic. The first warning came as they reached the departure gate. The monitor above the desk flickered, red letters flashing. "Delayed." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Around them, passengers stirred, pulling out phones, murmuring with rising impatience. The air felt thick, electric. "Ladies and gentlemen," the gate agent announced in heavily accented English, "due to severe weather conditions affecting the New York area, Flight 709 is delayed until further notice." A ripple of frustration swept the crowd. Businessmen groaned, families slumped against suitcases, children cried. Jonathan remained standing, his posture stiff, his briefcase clutched like a weapon. "This isn't acceptable," he muttered, his voice low but sharp. "We should already be boarding." Beside him, Claire checked her phone with calm efficiency. "I've been monitoring the updates. The storm has grounded all flights into the tri-state area. Nothing is leaving Geneva tonight. Jonathan turned to her, his eyes cold. There must be options. I've contacted charter services. None are flying. It's not safe. The words hung in the air, final and immovable. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hale had no leverage, no strategy, no contingency plan strong enough to bend the weather. He hated the sensation. Hotels, he asked, his voice clipped. Claire's fingers moved swiftly over her phone screen. Most are booked solid, thousands of stranded passengers, but she paused, scrolling. There's one option left. Small place, 30 minutes from here, not glamorous, but it's available. Jonathan exhaled sharply through his nose. He despised compromise, yet compromise was all the storm allowed. Fine. Book it. 30 minutes later, their driver pulled up to a modest building on the outskirts of the city. The sign flickered against the Rain Airport Inn. Its lobby smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies, a world away from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of the luxury hotels Jonathan was accustomed to. The desk clerk looked apologetic as he shuffled papers. "We are fully booked, sir. Only one room remains." Double occupancy? Jonathan straightened, prepared to object, but Claire touched his sleeve lightly just enough to still him. Her voice was steady. "We'll take it." He stared at her, surprised by the calm certainty in her tone. For years, he had dictated decisions, yet in that moment, she carried the authority. He let her. Room 214 was small, functional. A queen bed dominated the space, with a narrow sofa pushed against the wall. The window overlooked the parking lot, where rain streaked the glass in crooked lines. The carpet smelled faintly damp, and the bedside lamp flickered when switched on. Jonathan set his briefcase on the desk, surveying the room as though it were enemy territory. "Unacceptable," he muttered. "I'll take the sofa." "Absolutely not," Claire countered, placing her bag on the small table. "You're the CEO. You'll take the bed." He turned, surprised again by the firmness in her voice. She had never contradicted him outright. Not in meetings, not in the office, not even in private. "Miss Whitman Claire," she interrupted gently. "We're stranded in a roadside hotel. Jonathan. Formalities don't really apply." Her use of his first name startled him more than the storm outside. For 3 years, she had been Miss Whitman efficient, distant, reliable. But here, in this ordinary room with its faded curtains and buzzing light bulbs, she looked different. Her blazer was creased, a strand of hair had escaped her bun, and her voice carried warmth he rarely heard. For the first time, she wasn't just his assistant, she was human. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded once. "All right, Claire." Outside, thunder cracked across the sky, rattling the window. Inside, silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tension. Jonathan loosened his tie, suddenly aware of how small the room felt. This was not the world he knew: the boardrooms, the private jets, the sterile perfection of his glass tower. This was life stripped bare, rain-soaked, imperfect, unavoidable. And somewhere deep inside, though he would never admit it aloud, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: relief. Room 214 was hardly more than a box. Beige walls, a scuffed dresser, a narrow couch pushed against one side, and a queen-size bed that took up most of the floor space. The faint hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, mixing with the steady rhythm of rain against the window. Jonathan stood at the desk, opening his laptop with the precision of a man determined to reassert order. He connected to the hotel's unreliable Wi-Fi, scowling at the lag as though it were a personal affront. Claire, meanwhile, set her bag down and moved with easy familiarity, as though she had stayed in places like this before. She slipped off her blazer and draped it neatly over the chair. Without the sharp lines of her work attire, she seemed softer, more approachable. Her hair loosened, auburn strands falling around her face. For the first time, Jonathan realized how young she really was. "I'll get some tea going," she said, spotting a small electric kettle on the dresser. Jonathan didn't look up from his screen. "That won't be necessary." Claire ignored him. She filled the kettle from the bathroom sink, humming softly under her breath as she waited for it to boil. The sound unsettled Jonathan. In the office, she never hummed. She never did anything that wasn't directly tied to efficiency. When the kettle clicked off, she poured the steaming water into 2 chipped mugs provided by the hotel. She dropped in a tea bag from her own small stash, which she always carried for long trips. Then, without asking, she set 1 cup beside Jonathan's laptop. He glanced at it as though it were foreign. "I don't usually drink tea." "That's not what I asked," she replied gently. "Chamomile. It'll help." Her tone wasn't defiant, but it carried a quiet certainty he wasn't used to. He found himself lifting the mug almost in spite of himself. The ceramic was warm, grounding. The faint floral scent filled the space between them. Jonathan took a cautious sip. It wasn't coffee, sharp and commanding. It was mild, soothing. He set the cup down carefully, as though acknowledging something he didn't want to admit. Claire had settled on the couch, pulling her legs beneath her gray sweater soft and worn. She looked nothing like the crisp, unshakable assistant who walked 3 steps behind him through boardrooms. She looked like someone he might have passed in a small-town cafe, scribbling in a notebook, sipping tea. "Did you grow up in Chicago?" he asked suddenly, surprising himself. Personal questions were not part of their dynamic. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No, a little town in Ohio. You wouldn't know it if I named it. We had 1 diner, 1 post office, and a 4th of July parade every summer that felt like the biggest thing in the world." Jonathan leaned back slightly, closing his laptop. "And yet, you ended up here? College, internships, 1 job led to another." She shrugged, her eyes softening with memory. "But sometimes I miss it. Fireflies in the backyard, walking down streets where everyone knew your name. It felt safe." The word lingered. Safe. Jonathan realized how foreign it felt on his own tongue. His childhood had been anything but. Boarding schools, diplomatic receptions, dinners where silence was preferable to laughter. Safety, to him, had always been measured by control, never by comfort. He studied her quietly, noticing the way her fingers traced the rim of her mug, the way her hair fell loose around her face. For years, she had been his anchor in the storm of business, predictable, reliable, untouchable. But here, in this small room, she was something else, human. And it unsettled him. Jonathan forced his gaze back to his laptop, reopening a spreadsheet. "We should review the Yamamoto terms, the indemnity clause." Claire's voice cut in softly, not unkind. "Jonathan, it's almost midnight. You don't have to work every second." His fingers froze over the keyboard. No one ever told him that. Not the board, not his investors, not even his closest advisors. Work was the air he breathed. To stop was unthinkable. But when he looked up, he found her watching him not as an assistant waiting for instructions, but as a woman seeing him for what he was, a man exhausted by the cage he'd built around himself. He swallowed, uneasy. "Work doesn't stop just because we're inconvenienced." "I know," she said softly, "but life doesn't stop either." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. Jonathan felt a shift deep inside, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath him had tilted a fraction. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if maintaining distance was strength or cowardice. Claire sipped her tea, her eyes returning to the rain-streaked window. Jonathan studied her in the dim light, realizing that after 3 years of flawless efficiency, this was the first time he had truly seen her. And the realization unsettled him more than any storm ever could. The storm outside had grown restless. Rain lashed against the narrow window of room 214, and thunder rolled in waves across the Swiss sky. Inside, the yellow glow of a single lamp cast long shadows over the bed and couch, turning the cramped hotel room into something unexpectedly intimate. Jonathan sat at the desk, his laptop open, a spreadsheet glowing across the screen. but his concentration was gone. Numbers blurred together, their sharp edges dissolving. His gaze kept drifting toward the couch, where Claire sat cross-legged, her sweater pulled tight around her shoulders, her own laptop balanced on her knees. She looked comfortable. Not efficient, not precise, simply comfortable. Her bare feet were tucked beneath her auburn hair falling loose as she typed. Jonathan found himself watching her reflection in the dark window, unsettled by how different she appeared from the Claire he knew. After a long silence, Claire closed her laptop with a soft click. "It's nearly midnight," she said gently. "You should rest." "Work doesn't stop because of a storm," Jonathan replied, his voice sharper than intended. She tilted her head, studying him, not with judgment, but with a calm curiosity that made him uneasy. "Jonathan, may I ask you something personal?" He froze. His instinct was to say no, to retreat behind the walls of professionalism that had kept him safe for decades. But something in her tone, steady, compassionate, broke through his defenses. He nodded once. "When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy?" The question landed like a physical blow. Jonathan leaned back, his fingers tightening around the arm of the chair. His first instinct was to deflect, to speak of business victories, successful contracts, milestones reached. But those weren't happiness. Not really. They were achievement. They were control. He opened his mouth, closed it again. For a moment, he looked almost lost. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he'd expected. Claire didn't look away. Not even once. "Not since you were a boy." A memory stirred. Jonathan inhaled sharply, then exhaled as though bracing himself. "When I was 12, I built model airplanes. Cardboard, wood, glue. They weren't perfect, but they flew. Sometimes higher than I thought possible. Sometimes sideways into hedges." For the first time that evening, his lips curved in something like a smile. "What happened?" Claire asked softly. "My father happened." Jonathan's voice hardened, then cracked with something older, deeper. "He told me toys wouldn't take me anywhere. That if I wanted a future, I needed to focus on grades, on discipline, on becoming the man he expected me to be. And you believed him? I didn't have a choice." Jonathan's gaze dropped to the desk, his voice low. "I stopped building. I buried the plans, the sketches, the excitement. I convinced myself it didn't matter, that success was enough." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the storm outside. Then Claire spoke, her voice steady but gentle. "You know, I write." Jonathan looked up, startled. "Write poetry, journals, nothing professional, just words I never show anyone." She hesitated, almost embarrassed. "Most of it is terrible, sentimental, but it's honest. It's the only place I let myself be messy." Jonathan studied her, struck by the quiet vulnerability in her admission. Claire Whitman, the flawless assistant, the machine who anticipated every detail. She wrote poetry. He had never imagined it. "Why don't you share it?" he asked. "Because honesty isn't polished," she said simply. "And polished is what people expect from me. If they saw the real words, the real thoughts, they might not understand." Jonathan leaned back, the words resonating deeper than he wanted to admit. For years, he had hidden behind polished, perfect presentations, immaculate offices, every detail calculated to protect him from exposure. And yet, sitting here with Claire, he felt as though she had seen through him entirely. "You're not what I thought," he said slowly. She tilted her head. "And what did you think I was, a machine? Efficient, precise, unshakable? I depended on it." Claire smiled faintly. "Machines don't notice the way you tap your pen 17 times before walking into meetings you dread, or how you stare out the window at exactly 3:47 every afternoon, as if remembering something." Jonathan froze. "You notice that I notice everything," she said softly. "It's part of my job, but also, I just wanted to understand." For a moment, the air between them shifted, charged with something unsaid. Jonathan felt exposed, as though someone had stripped away the armor he'd worn his entire life. Yet, instead of fear, there was a strange sense of relief. "You've been watching me for 3 years," he murmured. "Yes." Her answer was quiet, almost a whisper. "Every day." "Why?" Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "Because beneath all that control, I see someone who's forgotten how to breathe, and I keep hoping one day you'll remember." Thunder rumbled again, shaking the thin walls. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, not with anger or fear, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. He closed his laptop, the sound louder than intended, and leaned forward. "Claire, I don't know how to—" His voice faltered, raw and unsteady. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've built." "You don't have to know tonight," she said softly. "You just have to let yourself be here. With me." Her words landed like a hand extended across a chasm. For the first time in decades, Jonathan considered taking it. The storm outside raged on, but in room 214 something had shifted. Two people who had lived side by side for 3 years without truly seeing each other now sat in the dim light, stripped of their armor, bound by truths too long unspoken. For Jonathan, it was terrifying. For Claire, it was a risk. For both, it was the beginning of something neither could control. The storm had passed by dawn. Thin sunlight filtered through the rain-streaked glass of room 214, painting the modest walls in muted gold. The air was heavy with the scent of damp carpet and the faint sweetness of chamomile tea left unfinished on the desk. Jonathan stirred first. His back ached from the awkward angle he'd settled into, sometime after 2 in the morning, sitting against the wall near the couch. At some point, Claire had dozed off beside him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He had let her stay there, afraid that moving might break the fragile peace of the moment. Now, in the pale morning light, the room felt suspended an island untouched by the outside world. Jonathan found himself studying her face, softened in sleep, the faint curve of her lips, the loose strands of auburn hair that brushed his arm. She looked younger like this, vulnerable, even. A thought crept in, uninvited. Is this what happiness feels like? He hadn't asked himself that question in years. Happiness was a concept he'd filed away, too abstract to matter, too fragile to trust. But here, in the quiet of a roadside hotel room, with the storm receding and her steady breathing beside him, something inside him stirred. Then, just as quickly, came the doubt. Was this real, or just the strange intimacy of two colleagues trapped by circumstance, stripped of their usual armor, a moment of weakness that would vanish once the schedules and contracts returned? Jonathan shifted slightly, pulling away. Claire stirred, blinking against the light. For a moment, their eyes met. Something unspoken lingered between them, an echo of the night's confessions, a fragile thread of connection. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," he replied, too quickly. She sat up, brushing her hair back into some semblance of order. Within seconds, he watched the transformation take place, the soft edges hardening, the casual warmth replaced by the composed professionalism he knew so well. By the time she slipped her blazer back on, she was once again Claire Whitman, his impeccable assistant. Jonathan felt the loss like a door closing. She moved to the desk, gathering her notes, checking her phone for updates on the flights. "The storm has cleared over the Atlantic," she said matter-of-factly. "Airlines are resuming operations this afternoon. I'll call to confirm our rebooking." Her voice was calm, efficient, untouched by the vulnerability of last night. Jonathan nodded, though a knot tightened in his chest. Part of him wanted to stop her, to say something that would hold on to the honesty they had shared in the dark. But the words wouldn't come. He was too practiced at silence, too skilled at building walls. Instead, he busied himself with his tie, straightening it until the knot was perfect. It was absurd. He realized fussing over an accessory in a budget hotel room, but the ritual steadied him, restored some semblance of the man he knew how to be. When Claire turned back, she was scrolling through her tablet. "I've already sent your notes to the Zurich team, and the Yamamoto revisions are ready for signature once we're back in Chicago." Jonathan stared at her. Had last night meant nothing to her, or was she, like him, too afraid to acknowledge it in the light of day? He wanted to ask. Instead, he heard himself say, "Good. Thank you." The words felt hollow. Silence stretched between them, thicker than the walls of the room. The intimacy of the night before had evaporated, replaced by an awkward distance neither seemed able to cross. Jonathan poured himself into packing, folding his suit with military precision. Claire busied herself with emails. They moved around each other like strangers rehearsing a routine. When the driver arrived to take them back to the airport, Jonathan cast one last glance at the room. Beige walls, flickering lamp, faint scent of chamomile. It should have been forgettable. Yet, he knew, with an unease that unsettled him, that room 214 would stay with him long after the storm had passed. The car ride was quiet. Claire typed on her phone, her expression focused. Jonathan stared out the window, watching the gray landscape blur by. He wanted to break the silence, to tell her what he had felt, what he still felt. But the words caught in his throat, heavy with the weight of decades of restraint. At the airport, the departure boards glowed with restored order. Flights were moving again, schedules were back on track. Jonathan should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something else entirely. Caged. The skyline of Chicago rose like a fortress of glass and steel as the jet descended. Jonathan Hale had always felt a surge of satisfaction returning home, proof of control, of empire, of territory conquered. But this time, as the city's sharp edges glittered beneath the afternoon sun, a strange heaviness pressed against his chest. The drive from O'Hare to downtown unfolded in familiar silence. The black sedan hummed along the freeway, cutting through traffic with practiced efficiency. Claire sat 3 seats away, her posture immaculate, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated his schedule for the week ahead. "Your meeting with Patterson Industries has been moved to 4 o'clock. Mr. Hale," she said crisply, her voice carrying none of the warmth he'd heard in the dim light of room 214. "The Yamamoto contracts are prepared for signature. Legal has cleared the indemnity clause revisions." Jonathan turned his head toward the window, hiding the flicker of disappointment that crossed his face at the formal address. "Mr. Hale." Last night, it had been Jonathan. "Good," he replied, his tone flat, professional. The car slid to a stop outside the glass tower of Hale Dynamics. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet energy. Assistants hurried between elevators. Executives spoke in hushed tones over tablets. The air smelled faintly of polished marble and ambition. Jonathan stepped inside, briefcase in hand, his stride steady and commanding. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath the polished exterior, something gnawed at him. By the time he reached the 48th floor, the sense of suffocation had become impossible to ignore. His office, once a sanctuary, felt like a gilded prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting, the river glinting below, the horizon stretching endlessly. Yet all Jonathan saw was glass. Glass walls, glass ceilings, glass barriers. He sat at his desk, opening his laptop, but the numbers on the screen blurred. His mind drifted back to the cramped hotel room, to the sound of Claire's voice in the dark, steady and unguarded. Because beneath all that control, I see someone who's forgotten how to breathe. He rubbed his temples, frustrated by how easily the memory unraveled him. The knock at his door was light, precise. "Mr. Hale." He looked up. Claire stood in the doorway, portfolio in hand, her expression calm, professional, unreadable. "The Patterson contracts," she said. "Thank you," Jonathan replied. He wanted to add Claire, but the name stuck in his throat. Instead, He reached for the papers without meeting her eyes. She lingered for half a second, as though expecting him to say something more. When he didn't, she turned to leave. "Miss Whitman," he called after her. She paused, her back straight, her hand still on the door frame. "Yes, Mr. Hale." He opened his mouth, searching for words, any words that might bridge the growing gulf between them. But what came out was the safe choice, the professional mask. "That will be all." Claire nodded once. "Of course." And then she was gone, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The silence that followed was unbearable. Jonathan pushed back from his desk, rising to pace before the window. He stared out at the city, his city stretching in endless grids of control and order. For years, this view had steadied him, reminded him of his achievements, his dominance. Now, it mocked him. He remembered the way Claire had laughed softly in room 214, admitting she wrote poetry no one had ever read. The way her eyes had softened when she asked him about happiness. The way she had seen him, not the CEO, not the empire, just the boy who once dreamed of building airplanes. And he had let her go. The thought clawed at him, pulling apart the seams of his carefully constructed life. He wanted to call her back, to break the silence with something reckless and human. But fear held him frozen. Fear of scandal, fear of vulnerability, fear of discovering that the fragile connection they had shared in the storm might not survive the daylight. By evening, the office emptied, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts. He sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, staring at the Patterson contract, but seeing only Claire's face. Every detail of her had burned itself into him, the way her fingers curled around a teacup, the way her voice softened when she spoke of her hometown, the way she said his name as though it mattered. For years, he had believed control was freedom, that order was strength. But now, with everything perfectly in place, his empire, his office, his schedule, he felt more imprisoned than ever. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, pressing his hands against his eyes. What am I doing? The question echoed in the silence, unanswered. He thought of calling her. He thought of knocking on her door, confessing everything he had buried. But instead, he sat alone in his glass tower, suffocated by the life he had built and terrified of what it might cost to tear it down. By midweek, the rhythm of Hale dynamics had resumed, meetings stacked back to back, contracts moving across desks, quarterly reports updated in real time. On the surface, Jonathan Hale's empire thrived. Yet beneath the polished routine, something in him was unraveling. He noticed things now, things he had trained himself for years to ignore, like the way Claire's smile lingered when Logan Pierce from marketing stopped by her desk, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. Logan was younger, ambitious, with the kind of easy charm Jonathan had never cultivated. Jonathan caught himself watching from his office doorway, his chest tightening at the sight of Claire's soft laugh. Later, he saw Devin, the eager intern, drop off a small bouquet of daisies. Claire thanked him with a smile, gentle, polite, but warmer than anything Jonathan had received since their return from Geneva. By Thursday, even James from accounting had found an excuse to hover at her desk, cracking some awkward joke that made her laugh despite herself. Jonathan told himself it was harmless, politeness, nothing more. But the knot in his chest tightened with every passing day. He, who had always dismissed emotion as weakness, now found himself gripped by something he couldn't calculate, couldn't control. Jealousy. He hated the word. But there was no denying it. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, Jonathan lingered in his glass-walled office, staring at the glow of the city. Claire was still at her desk, tidying up files, her movements precise and deliberate. Her phone rang softly. She answered without hesitation. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice softening in a way Jonathan had never heard in meetings. He hadn't intended to listen, but the office was quiet, and her words carried, "No, Mom, there's no one," she said with a gentle laugh. "I know I'm 27. Yes, I know you want grandkids, but I'm focused on work right now." Jonathan forced his gaze back to the window, trying to grant her privacy, yet he couldn't stop his ears from catching every word. Her voice dropped lower, tinged with something heavier. No, he doesn't see me that way. Honestly, I don't think Mr. Hale even sees me as a person. Not really. To him, I'm just efficient, a machine that makes his life easier. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. Not a person. For 3 years, she had stood beside him, carrying burdens no one else noticed, anticipating every need, guarding his world with unshakable precision. And yet, because of his walls, his distance, his obsession with control, she believed she was invisible to him. He had made her feel invisible. "Mom, please." Claire continued gently. "It's fine. I like my job. I like being useful. But sometimes I wish someone would see me, really see me." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Jonathan felt his chest tighten with something raw and unfamiliar. Shame. He had heard enough. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as her quiet conversation drifted on. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding in a way that no hostile negotiation had ever provoked. For years, Jonathan had prided himself on his ability to calculate risk, to anticipate failure before it struck. But he had never calculated this, that the one person he depended on most, the one constant in his perfectly ordered life, could slip through his fingers not because of rivals like Logan or Devon, but because of his own blindness. He rose abruptly, crossing to the window. Below, Chicago pulsed with life, people walking hand in hand, laughing on street corners, living in ways he had forgotten were possible. "She thinks I don't see her." The thought repeated itself like a drumbeat, unrelenting, and for the first time in decades, Jonathan Hale realized that his empire meant nothing if the cost was losing the only person who had ever truly seen him. The city was winding down when Jonathan finally made his decision. It was past 8, the office mostly empty, the hum of elevators and phones replaced by the distant hush of traffic below. His desk was still cluttered with contracts and projections, but he hadn't looked at them in hours. His mind was fixed on only one thing: Claire. He had spent days pretending, burying himself in numbers, trying to restore the careful distance that had defined their relationship, but every moment without her warmth pressed harder against his chest. Every time he saw another man linger by her desk, every time he remembered her voice on the phone saying he didn't see her, the ache deepened. Jonathan Hale had built an empire by never hesitating. Tonight, he refused to hesitate any longer. "Miss Whitman." He called from his doorway, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Claire looked up from her desk, surprised. She was already slipping on her coat, ready to leave for the night. "Yes, Mr. Hale, come in, please." Something in his tone made her pause. Slowly, she set her coat down and entered, her portfolio clutched like armor. She sat across from him, posture perfect, waiting. Jonathan leaned against the edge of his desk instead of sitting behind it, closing the distance between them. He took a breath, steadying himself. "This isn't about contracts or schedules," he began. "This isn't business at all." Her brow furrowed. "Then what is it?" He forced himself to meet her eyes. "It's you, Claire. I can't pretend anymore. That night in Geneva, it wasn't a lapse. It wasn't weakness. It was the first time in years I felt alive, and I can't go back to pretending it meant nothing." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Claire's lips parted, then pressed into a tight line. Her grip on the portfolio tightened. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "don't do this. I have to." He pressed. "For 3 years, I've hidden behind professionalism, behind control. But the truth is I see you. I've always seen you. And his voice faltered. "I love you, Claire." The words filled the room, shocking in their rawness. For a moment, Claire simply stared at him, her green eyes wide with disbelief. Then, slowly, Her expression hardened. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't get to say that." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Why not?" "Because this isn't real," she said, her voice breaking with restrained emotion. "You're my boss. You've built an empire, a reputation. You don't throw all of that away because of one storm and a night in a cheap hotel room. It wasn't just the storm, wasn't it?" Her voice rose, her hands trembling now. "People get vulnerable when they're stranded. When they're scared, they cling to whoever's near. But this isn't some romance novel, Jonathan. You can't upend both our lives because of loneliness." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice low but urgent. "You think this is loneliness? I've lived with loneliness for 30 years. This he gestured between them. This is the opposite. For the first time in decades, I feel seen, and I won't bury that again." Claire stood abruptly, pacing to the window, her reflection fractured in the glass. "Do you hear yourself? If this gets out, I lose my credibility. You lose your company. We destroy everything we've both worked for. And for what? For a feeling that might not even survive." Daylight Jonathan's pulse hammered. Fear gnawed at him, but he forced the words out anyway. "For you. For the chance at something real." Claire turned sharply, anger flashing in her eyes. "You can't just walk away from Hale Dynamics because of me." Jonathan drew a steady breath. "I already have." Her expression faltered. "What I called the board this afternoon," he said quietly. "I told them I'm stepping down. Tomorrow, they'll begin transition plans." For a moment, Claire's face was a portrait of shock. Then she laughed bitterly, though tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. "You're insane." "Maybe," Jonathan admitted, "but insanity feels more honest than the prison I've been living in. I built Hale Dynamics to prove something to a father who never cared, to fill the void of a childhood stripped of joy. But none of it matters, not the contracts, not the empire, if it costs me the one person who makes me want to breathe again." Claire's voice trembled. "Jonathan, you can't expect me to believe you'd give up everything, just for me." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Not just for you, for myself, too, for the boy who wanted to build airplanes before he was told to bury his dreams, for the man who's tired of glass towers and empty victories. But yes, also for you, because you reminded me what it feels like to want more than survival." Tears slipped down Claire's cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. "Jonathan," he reached out, then stopped, letting his hand hover inches from hers. "I'm not asking for certainty. I'm asking for a chance, for the risk, because for the first time in my life, risk feels worth it." Claire shook her head, torn between fear and longing. "You don't know what you're asking me to give up. My career, my reputation, everything I've built, I do," he said firmly. "And I know what I'm asking myself to give up too. But Claire, what if we're both worth it?" The silence stretched, thick with unshed tears and unspoken truths. Claire turned back to the window, staring out at the glittering city. She whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know if I can trust this." "Trust you." Jonathan's voice softened. "Then let me prove it. Not with words, with choices. Starting with the only one that matters, I choose you." The words hung in the air, raw and terrifying. Claire closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. For 3 years, she had been the perfect assistant, hiding her heart behind professionalism. Now, that heart was breaking open, torn between reason and desire, fear and hope. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and though doubt still flickered there, something else glimmered beneath it, something fragile, possibility. 3 months later, the skyline of Chicago was no longer Jonathan Hale's morning view. Gone were the mirrored glass towers and the endless buzz of investors and board meetings. In their place, California stretched wide and golden, with rolling hills, endless sky, and the salty breath of the Pacific drifting inland. The headquarters of Aero West, a young aerospace startup, looked nothing like Hale Dynamics. It was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Palo Alto, white walls scuffed by years of use, workbenches cluttered with prototypes, blueprints taped directly to the walls. Instead of suits and polished shoes, engineers wore jeans and sneakers, their voices alive with ideas and laughter. And in the middle of it all was Jonathan. He looked different now. No tailored suit, no silk tie, just a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, jeans slightly worn, hair not perfectly styled, but brushed back in a way that made him look younger. His hands were ink-stained from sketching propulsion designs with a team half his age. And when he laughed at a failed prototype sputtering on the test stand, the sound was startlingly genuine. Claire watched him from the mezzanine office above the lab floor. For years, she had seen him command rooms with icy precision. Now, she saw him lean over a table with childlike eagerness, eyes bright, his fingers moving quickly across a tablet as he scribbled adjustments. It was as though she was finally seeing the boy he once described, the boy who had wanted to build airplanes before the world told him to stop. She smiled, then turned back to her own desk. Her new title, Director of Operations, was printed neatly on the nameplate, Dr. Vasquez. The company's founder had offered it to her after 2 weeks of watching Claire streamline schedules, negotiate with suppliers, and calm the chaos that came with raw innovation. At first, Claire had hesitated. She'd spent 3 years hiding behind Jonathan's shadow, unsure if her own voice mattered. But here, in this smaller, scrappier world, she was learning it did. Decisions stuck, ideas carried weight, and every success felt personal. That evening, as the day's work wound down, Jonathan climbed the stairs to her office, carrying 2 paper cups of bad coffee. He set one in front of her with a grin. "Fuel," he said, "though you might regret it." She laughed, shaking her head. "Still better than the hotel tea." For a moment, their eyes met, and the memory of Geneva flickered between them, of storms and tea and truths spilled in the dark. "Walk with me," Jonathan asked. They stepped outside onto the balcony that overlooked the valley. The sun was setting, spilling orange and rose across the horizon. Below, the workshop lights glowed like fireflies, a reminder of the restless mind still tinkering inside. Claire leaned against the railing, sipping her coffee. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. Jonathan tilted his head. "Leaving Hale Dynamics." She nodded. He was silent for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower. Finally, he said, "I regret the years I spent pretending control was enough. I regret how long it took me to see you." He turned, his eyes steady on hers. "But this, no, not once." Claire looked down at her coffee, her lips curving in a faint smile. "It hasn't been easy. The media tore you apart for walking away. People whispered that I was the reason." "They weren't wrong," Jonathan said softly. She glanced up, startled. "You were the reason," he continued. "Not because you pulled me away, but because you reminded me there was something worth walking toward." Her throat tightened. "That's a heavy thing to carry." "Not when you're walking with me," he said gently. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but full of something unspoken trust, perhaps, or the fragile beginnings of peace. Claire breathed in the California air, the scent of eucalyptus and ocean salt. "When I was younger, I thought success meant security, a corner office, a steady paycheck, respect. But now," she looked out at the horizon, "now I think it means being able to wake up and not feel invisible." Jonathan's hand brushed against hers on the railing, not quite holding it, but close enough. "Then I hope you never feel invisible again." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deeper shades of crimson and violet. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. They had made their trade power for peace, certainty for risk, glass towers for open skies. And as the first stars blinked awake above California, both knew they had chosen well. 2 years had passed since Jonathan Hale traded his empire of glass and steel for a warehouse filled with restless minds and impossible dreams. Now, on a crisp October morning, Aero West stood on the edge of history. The company's prototype, a sleek, emerald-tinted aircraft designed for sustainable commercial flight, rested on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base. Reporters jostled for space behind barriers, cameras poised, investors murmured in nervous anticipation, engineers triple-checked data on their tablets, their faces pale with a mix of exhaustion and hope. Jonathan stood near the observation deck, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in the boardroom. He wore no suit today, just a dark blazer over a simple shirt, his hair swept back by the desert wind. At 51, he looked leaner, more alive than he had in decades. Beside him, Claire adjusted her badge and clasped a tablet to her chest. Her title now read, Vice President of Global Operations. But that hardly captured who she was to him. For the last 2 years, she had been his partner in every sense, organizing, guiding, challenging, reminding him daily that risk was only worth taking if it was shared. The loudspeakers crackled to minus 10 minutes until test launch. Jonathan exhaled slowly. The crowd behind the glass observation window buzzed louder, but his focus narrowed to the woman standing beside him. Claire, he said quietly. She turned, her expression calm, but her eyes bright. Nervous, he smiled faintly, terrified, but not of the launch. Her brow arched. Then what? He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling just slightly, and pulled out a small velvet box. For a heartbeat, Claire froze. Jonathan, he knelt right there, in front of the murmuring crowd, in the shadow of the plane that symbolized every dream he had ever buried and resurrected. 2 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. We were stranded in a storm. I thought my life had unraveled, but really it had finally begun. Her eyes shimmered, and she pressed a hand to her lips. You showed me that success isn't control, Jonathan continued. It's not power or perfection. It's the courage to love, the courage to dream again. I've spent my life building machines that can take people higher. But with you, Claire, I've learned how to soar. The crowd was beginning to notice, murmurs spreading like wildfire. But Jonathan saw only her. Claire Whitman, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you build the rest of this uncertain, terrifyingly beautiful life with me? For a long moment, silence hung heavy. The entire observation deck seemed to hold its breath. Tears slid down Claire's cheeks. She let out a soft, incredulous laugh and whispered, Yes, yes. Of course. Applause erupted behind them. Jonathan slipped the ring onto her hand, a constellation of diamonds that caught the morning light like captured starlight. She pulled him up and kissed him, unbothered by cameras, unbothered by whispers. It was the kind of kiss that rewrote the story of who they had been and who they would become. The loudspeaker cut through the cheers, T-minus 30 seconds. Hand in hand, they turned to face the runway. The aircraft's engines hummed to life, a sound deep and resonant, like the earth itself preparing to exhale. Jonathan tightened his grip on Claire's hand, feeling her steady strength beside him. Ready? He asked. Always, she whispered. 10, 9, 8. The roar built, vibrating through the glass, through their bones. 3, 2, 1. Flames burst from the thrusters, and the green aircraft surged forward, faster, higher, lifting into the endless California sky. The crowd erupted in shouts of awe and relief, but Jonathan and Claire stood in silence, eyes lifted. The plane climbed smoothly, leaving a streak of light against the blue, a symbol not just of human ingenuity, but of resilience of two people who had dared to risk everything for something real. Jonathan's throat tightened. Look, he murmured. We did it. Claire leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. No, she said softly. We did more than that. We found where we belong, above them. The aircraft soared, defying gravity, defying doubt. And in that moment, Jonathan knew the launch wasn't just about engines or innovation. It was about love reborn, about dreams resurrected, about a life rebuilt not on control, but on courage. Sometimes, storms ground you. Sometimes, they cancel flights, force you into places you never meant to go. But sometimes, if you are very lucky, they carry you exactly where you need to be. The plane disappeared into the horizon, a glint of green swallowed by sky. Jonathan pressed a kiss to Claire's temple, his heart lighter than it had ever been. "Here's to the next adventure," he whispered. Claire smiled, the ring catching the sunlight as she laced her fingers with his. "Together," she said. And as the desert wind rushed across the runway, and the crowd behind them erupted in cheers, they both knew whatever came next. They would face it side by side, hand in hand, hearts unafraid, at its heart. Jonathan and Claire's story is not just about romance, it is about courage. For years, Jonathan lived inside a prison of his own, making schedules, power, control. It took a canceled flight, a storm, and the quiet honesty of someone who truly saw him to make him realize what he was missing. How many of us do the same? We cling to security, to routines, to the image others expect, even if it costs us joy. We silence our hearts because risk feels too frightening. But life has a way of grounding us, of forcing us to stop and ask what truly matters. Jonathan's leap reminds us that no empire, no success, can replace the simple gift of being loved and understood. Claire's honesty teaches us that sometimes, love asks for bravery not only to hold on, but to be seen as we truly are. The lesson is simple yet profound. It is never too late to choose again. Never too late to let go of what traps us and reach for what frees us. Sometimes, the storm we fear most is the very thing that carries us where we were always meant to be. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and for listening to Jonathan and Claire's journey. If their story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What part spoke to you most? Your support means the world. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, courage, and second chances. Together, let's keep building a community where stories remind us that it's never too late to choose happiness.